Welcome to Whispers of the Night. This is Adam, your host for today's mystery. Today we have another Hercule Poirot story. And this one begins with a glittering gala, a priceless relic, and a theft carried out in the blink of an eye. But as Poirot soon learns, not everything stolen is what it seems. If you enjoy these mysteries, please give this video a like and share it with fellow lovers of detective stories and tell me where you're tuning in from. I always read your comments and truly enjoy hearing from you. Now, pour yourself a cup of coffee, stay curious, and let's begin. Chapter 1. The Night of the Damsel. The evening air of Constantinople hung thick with the scent of jasmine and coal smoke as our taxi rattled through the narrow streets toward the Topkapi Museum. Beside me, Poirot sat with his customary rigidity, one gloved hand resting upon his walking stick, the other adjusting his bow tie for what must have been the third time since we had left the Hotel Poirot Palace. "You are certain, Hastings, that the invitation specified siete precisely?" he asked, consulting his pocket watch with a frown. "Quite certain, old chap," I assured him. The British ambassador was most particular about the time. Our presence in Constantinople had been something of an accident. Poirot had accepted a commission in Athens, a delicate matter involving a Greek shipping magnate, and we had chosen to travel overland, breaking our journey at the ancient crossroads between Europe and Asia. The Hotel Poirot Palace had been recommended for its comfort and respectability, and we had planned to stay but 2 nights before continuing our journey. Those plans had changed abruptly when a telegram from Sir Geoffrey Thornton, the British ambassador, had reached us on our second morning. The British government, it seemed, had urgent need of Poirot's unique perspective on a matter of some delicacy. The details would be explained at the gala unveiling of a remarkable Byzantine artifact, an event to which the cream of Constantinople's diplomatic society had been invited. The museum rose before us in the gathering dusk, its Ottoman architecture a study in elegant geometry. Torches blazed along the pathway, and motor cars deposited guests in evening dress upon the steps. I caught glimpses of military uniforms, diplomatic sashes, and the glitter of jewels at throats and wrists. Constantinople in 1900, Treinta-y-Nueve, was a city balanced on the edge of history, where the ghosts of Bantium walked beside the shadows of empires yet to fall. Inside we were directed through corridors lined with treasures that would have made the British Museum green with envy. Poirot paused before a display of Ottoman daggers, his head tilted to one side in that characteristic manner of his. "Beautiful, are they not?" he murmured. "Each blade tells a story, mon ami, of conquest, of power, of the hand that wielded it. Rather grim way to look at it, I observed, perhaps. But in this city, one cannot escape the past. It is everywhere, in the stones, in the very air we breathe." We entered the main gallery to find it already crowded with guests. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the assembled company, and waiters moved silently between the groups with trays of champagne. At the far end of the room, draped in red velvet, stood what could only be the object of the evening's attention, a glass display case, currently concealed, beneath which I could make out the faint gleam of gold. Sir Geoffrey found us almost immediately, a tall man with the bearing of a career diplomat and worry lines etched deep around his eyes. "Poirot, thank heavens," he said, grasping my friend's hand with evident relief. "And Captain Hastings, good of you both to come. The matter you mentioned in your telegram," Poirot inquired quietly. Sir Geoffrey glanced around and lowered his voice. "Not here. After the unveiling, we'll speak privately, but I wanted you present tonight to observe there are complications, political sensitivities. The Turkish government is under considerable pressure regarding this artifact, and there are those who believe it should never be displayed at all." Before Pugh could respond, a gong sounded, and the crowd began to move toward the display case. A distinguished gentleman in Turkish formal dress stepped forward. Dr. Selim Ardag, the museum's curator, as we later learned. He raised his hands for silence. "Honored guests," he began, his English accented but clear. "Tonight we unveil a treasure lost to history for nearly 5 centuries. The Damsel of Constantinople, a jewel that unscraped the throat of Byzantine royalty, that survived the fall of an empire that has slept beneath the foundations of Hagia Sophia until this very year. He gestured, and two assistants drew back the velvet covering. A collective gasp rose from the assembly. Even from where we stood, I could see the pendant's extraordinary beauty. Gold filigree work of breathtaking delicacy framed a central medallion depicting a maiden, holding a sword in one hand and a dove in the other. Rubies and sapphires studded the design, catching the light and throwing rainbow patterns across the walls. The symbol of a city that stood between East and West, Dr. Ardag continued, between war and peace. Between the lights went out, darkness swallowed the gallery completely. I heard a woman's startled cry, the crash of breaking glass, and then confusion, voices calling out, the shuffle of feet, someone demanding that the lights be restored immediately. It could not have been more than 20 seconds before the chandeliers blazed back to life. But in that half-minute, everything had changed. The glass case stood shattered, shards glittering on the floor like fallen stars. The red velvet cushion that had supported the damsel of Constantinople lay empty, a dark hollow where the pendant had rested. The treasure was gone. In the stunned silence that followed, I felt Pooh's hand grip my arm with surprising strength. His green eyes swept the room, taking in every face, every expression of shock or dismay. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. Observe it carefully. Hastings. Everyone, everything. This moment it is most instructive. The evening air that had seemed so pleasant an hour ago now felt heavy with menace as we stood in that gallery, surrounded by the debris of a crime that had been executed with remarkable precision. Around us, guests talked in urgent whispers, while Dr. Ragg stood frozen before the empty case, his face the color of old parchment. Whatever Poirot had been brought here to prevent, we were already too late. Chapter those. Broken glass. Broken trust. The Turkish police arrived within the quarter hour, led by a Captain Kamal whose bristling moustache and military bearing suggested a man unused to crimes of such audacity occurring under his watch. He barked orders in Turkish, and uniformed officers began the tedious process of questioning guests and examining the scene. Poirot and I had been asked to remain by Sir Geoffrey, who stood in quiet consultation with Dr. Ard near the shattered display case. The curator's hands trembled as he gestured at the empty cushion, his earlier composure entirely shattered along with the glass. Monsieur Poirot, Sir Geoffrey said, approaching us with evident relief. Captain Kamal has agreed to allow you to observe the investigation. Your assistance would be most welcome. But naturally, Poirot replied, his eyes already scanning the scene with that methodical intensity I knew so well. Tell me, Sir Geoffrey, this artifact. There were those who opposed its display. Nespa. The ambassador glanced around and lowered his voice. Several parties have claimed rights to the pendant. The Turkish government insists it belongs to the nation as part of their heritage. A Russian immigrant countess maintains it was stolen from her family during the fall of Constantinople, and there have been whispers that the British Museum would pay handsomely for such a piece. A most complicated situation, Poirot murmured. He approached the display case, careful to avoid the scattered glass, and bent to examine the lock mechanism. The glass, it was broken from within, you observe. I peered at the shards from within. Surely that's impossible, Poirot. Unless the thief was already inside the case before the lights were extinguished, he finished. But no, that too is impossible. The case, it is too small. Yet observe the pattern of the glass, Hastings. The force came from inside, pushing outward. Captain Kamal joined us, his expression skeptical. Poirot, we have questioned all the guests. No one admits to seeing anything during the blackout. And the lights, how were they extinguished? The main electrical box was accessed. Someone threw the switch. Someone with knowledge of the building observed. He straightened, his head tilted in thought. Captain, I would speak with certain individuals if you permit. Dr. Ardag, naturally, and there are others present tonight who interest me greatly. Over the next hour, Poirot conducted his interviews in a small ante room off the main gallery. I sat beside him, taking notes as he questioned each person with that deceptive courtesy that so often lulled suspects into revealing more than they intended. Dr. Salem Marduk came first, still visibly shaken. He was a man of perhaps 50 with iron grey hair and the lean aesthetic look of a scholar. "This is a disaster," he said, sinking into a chair. "A catastrophe for the Museum for Turkey. The pendant was to be the centerpiece of our new Byzantine collection." "You have been curator here for how long?" Dr. Ardagaro asked. "Quince years. I have dedicated my life to preserving our cultural heritage. And yet there were those who questioned whether the damsel should be displayed at all." Ardag's jaw tightened. "There are always political pressures. Monsieur Poirot, foreign collectors who believe our treasures belong in their museums, exiles who make absurd claims to Ottoman property. But the pendant was found beneath Hagia Sophia on Turkish soil. It belongs to Turkey." "You are most passionate on the subject," Poirot observed gently. "Would you not be if your nation's history was constantly being plundered?" After Ardag departed, Professor Ernest Godfrey was shown in a British archaeologist with the rumpled appearance of a man more comfortable in excavation sites than drawing rooms. His tweed jacket was worn at the elbows, and his hands bore the stains of someone who worked with ancient artifacts. "Terribly business," he said, settling into the chair. "Though I must confess, I'm not entirely surprised." "Indeed." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "And why is that, Professor?" "Security was inadequate. I said as much to our dog last week. A piece of that value should never have been displayed in a case with such primitive locks. You examined the case, then I was consulted on the restoration of the pendant. I've worked with Byzantine jewelry extensively. In fact, I prepared a full report on the piece's authenticity and condition." "How interesting," Pooh murmured. "And you found it to be authentic?" Something flickered in Godfrey's eyes completely. "The workmanship is consistent with mid-16th century Constantinople. The gemstones are period appropriate. It's a remarkable specimen. You have the eye of the expert, Professor. Tell me, are you familiar with the legend of Princess Theodora?" "Of course. The pendant supposedly belonged to her. Whether that's true or merely romantic fiction is another matter. Byzantine provenance is notoriously difficult to establish with certainty." When the professor had gone, I turned to Poirot. He seemed rather defensive, didn't he? "Perhaps. Or perhaps merely the manner of a scholar whose expertise has been questioned too often." Poirot steepled his fingers. "You know, Hastings, it is said that Professor Godfrey left his position at the Ashen Museum under somewhat unfortunate circumstances." "What sort of circumstances?" Questions were raised about a Coptic manuscript they had authenticated. It proved to be a rather clever forgery. Poirot paused, most embarrassing for a man of his reputation. Our next interview proved altogether different in character. Countess Elena Vasilv swept into the room like a figure from another era, her bearing regal despite her evident age. She must have been Setenta if she was a day, but her dark eyes were sharp, and her voice carried the trace of Russian aristocracy. "I have told the Turkish police everything," she announced. "But I will tell you as well, Miss Poirot. That pendant belonged to my grandmother's family. It should never have been in this museum at all. You have documentation of this claim, madam?" "I have the word of my family. Is that not sufficient?" "In matters of law, madam, it is not always so simply." She drew herself up. "My family fled Constantinople when I was a child. We lost everything. Our home, our fortune, our heritage. That pendant is one of the few things that connects me to my past, and now it has been stolen by common thieves. You saw nothing during the blackout. Nothing. I was standing near the refreshment table. When the lights returned, there was chaos. And the young woman, Mademoiselle Ferrick, you know her." The Countess's expression hardened. "The translator. I have seen her about the museum. She works for Arduct, I believe." "Why do you ask?" "Merely curious, madam. She was standing quite close to the display case before the lights went out. After the Countess departed in a rustle of silk, I remarked, 'Rather a formidable woman.' What indeed? And one with a most compelling motive." Poirot rose. and walked to the window, gazing out at the dark outline of Hagia Sophia against the night sky. "But there is something here that troubles me, Hastings. Something that does not fit the pattern one would expect." "What's that?" He turned back to me, his expression thoughtful. "The method, monody, so theatrical, so dramatic, the sudden darkness, the shattered case, yet also so efficient, so precisely timed. It speaks of two different minds. You comprehend, one who seeks drama and one who seeks only results." I confess I did not entirely follow his reasoning, but before I could ask for clarification, there was a knock at the door. Captain Kamal interred his face grave. "Monsieur Poirot, there is news. We have found the electrical box. The lock was forced, but there is something else. A fragment of cloth caught on the metal edge. Fine quality, expensive," and he held up a small evidence bag. "This." Inside was a single gold bead, no larger than a peppercorn, with an intricate pattern etched into its surface. Poirot took the bag and examined it closely, holding it up to the light. His eyes narrowed. "From the pendant's chain?" I asked. "Most certainly," Poirot replied softly. "Which tells us, Hastings, that our thief did not leave the museum entirely unscathed. The implications of this discovery settled over us, like the evening mist that crept through Constantinople's ancient streets, and I felt the first stirrings of unease about what the morning might bring. Chapter 13. Blood on the cobblestones. The morning broke grey and sullen over Constantinople, a mist rolling in from the Bosphorus to wrap the city in damp gauze. Poirot and I had retired late the previous evening, our minds full of the theft and its implications. I had slept poorly, my dreams haunted by shattered glass and golden beads that rolled away into darkness. We were taking breakfast in the hotel dining room when Captain Kamal appeared, his face drawn and his uniform showing signs of a sleepless night. "Miss Poirot, I must speak with you urgently," he said, declining our offer of coffee with a curt shake of his head. "Or has been a murder." I nearly dropped my fork. "Murder connected to the theft. That is what we must determine." Kemal pulled out a chair and sat heavily. "A street vendor named Isef Demir was found dead this morning in an alley near the Grand Bazaar, stabbed through the bas the Bru the Grand Bazaar. Heart. At first, my men thought it was a simple robbery. His pockets were turned out empty. But then he reached into his jacket and withdrew a small evidence envelope. The officer who examined the body found this clutched in the dead man's hand. He tipped the contents onto the white tablecloth. It was a fragment of red velvet, no larger than a postage stamp, but unmistakably the same rich crimson as the lining of the display case we had seen the night before. Poirot picked it up delicately, holding it to the light from the window. His eyes had taken on that peculiar green intensity that signaled his mind was working at full capacity. "Most interesting?" he murmured. "Captain, this Isef, what manner of man was he?" "Humble, poor. He sold trinkets to tourists near the Spice Bazaar. Everyone knew him. He had worked that corner for 20 years. And his reputation?" Kamal shrugged. "Honest enough for a street vendor." Though he hesitated. "There are rumors he sometimes acted as a middleman for those wishing to sell items without official scrutiny. Nothing criminal, you understand, but perhaps not entirely proper either." "I see." Poirot set down the velvet fragment. "We must view the body and the place where it was found. Hastings, you will accompany us." "Of course," I said, though my breakfast had suddenly lost its appeal. The alley where Isef had died was a narrow passage between two crumbling buildings in the maze of streets behind the Grand Bazaar. The ancient stones seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and even in daylight the place felt oppressive. A chalk outline marked where the body had lain, and dark stains on the cobblestones told their own grim story. Poirot examined the scene with meticulous care, crouching to peer at the stones, running his gloved fingers along the rough walls, measuring distances with his walking stick. I watched him work, marveling as always at his ability to find significance in the smallest details. The wound was delivered by someone who knew what they were doing, Kamal explained. Clean thrust directly to the heart. Death would have been nearly instantaneous. And the time of death, the doctor estimates between dos and quattro pulgada the morning. Isef was last seen by his neighbor around midnight, closing up his stall. Poirot straightened, his expression thoughtful. So he works until midnight at the bazaar, then comes here to this alley. Why, it is not on the route to his home, I think. No, Kamal admitted. He lived in the opposite direction in Sultan Ahmed. Then he came here to meet someone, or perhaps he was following someone. We proceeded from the alley to the city morgue, a grim building near the old city walls. The attendant led us to a cold room, where Yusef's body lay beneath a white sheet. Poirot examined the corpse with clinical detachment, paying particular attention to the dead man's hands and clothing. You observe Hastings, the calluses on his fingers, a man who worked with his hands all his life, and here he indicated a spot on the threadbare jacket. Do you see? I looked closely and made out a small gold bead identical to the one found at the electrical box caught in the fabric near the lapel. Good Lord, I breathed from the pendant. Assuredly, which tells us that Isef had contact with either the pendant itself or with someone who had recently handled it. Poirot straightened and addressed Kamal. The contents of his pockets, what was taken. We cannot know for certain, but according to his neighbor, Isef usually carried a leather purse with his day's earnings. That was gone. Or perhaps never there at all. Poirot mused. It turned to the attendant. The knife. May I see it? The murder weapon was produced. A common kitchen knife with a worn wooden handle. There was nothing distinctive about it, nothing to suggest its owner or origin. After we left the morgue, Poirot insisted we visit the Grand Bazaar itself. The ancient covered market was already bustling with activity. Merchants calling out their wares in a dozen languages while tourists haggled over carpets, jewelry, and spices. The air was thick with the scents of cardamom, leather, and Turkish coffee. We found Isef's stall easily enough, a small wooden cart positioned near one of the main entrances, now draped in black cloth, as a mark of respect. An elderly man at the neighboring stall watched us approach with suspicious eyes. You are police? He asked in broken English. We investigate the death of your neighbor, Poirot replied. You knew him well. The old man's expression softened. Isef was a good man. Honest. This murder makes no sense. Who would kill him? He had nothing worth stealing, yet someone did kill him. Poirot said gently, Tell me, had you noticed anything unusual about him recently? Did he seem worried or excited, perhaps? The merchant considered this. 2 days ago, a foreigner came to his store. They spoke for a long time. Yusef seemed interested, more interested than usual. Can you describe this foreigner? A woman, not young, but elegant. She wore dark glasses and a silk scarf. European, I think, by her manner. And did you hear what they discussed? Only fragments. Something about gemstones. Isef often bought small gems from tourists who needed money. He said he knew collectors who would pay fair prices. Who thanked the man, and we moved away through the crowded aisles. When we were out of earshot, I said, a woman in dark glasses and a silk scarf. That could be almost anyone, Poirot. Indeed. But the mention of gemstones, it is most suggestive, is it not? He paused before a stall selling Byzantine coins and icons. Consider, mon ami, a humble street vendor is murdered, and a fragment of velvet from the museum is found in his hand. A gold bead from the stolen pendant is caught in his clothing, and 2 days before the theft, he is visited by a mysterious woman interested in gemstones. You think he was involved in the theft? I think, Hastings, that Isef may have been the most unfortunate man in Constantinople. He saw something, or knew something, or possessed something that made him dangerous to our thief. Poirot's face was grave, and that knowledge cost him his life. We emerged from the bazaar into the grey daylight. The mist had not lifted, and the ancient city seemed wrapped in secrets, layer upon layer of them, like the civilizations that had risen and fallen on these hills over millennia. Somewhere in this labyrinth of streets and history, a murderer walked free, and a priceless artifact lay hidden, and I could not shake the feeling that we had only begun to glimpse the true complexity of the web into which we had stumbled. Poirot was silent as we made our way back to the hotel, his face set in lines of deep concentration, and I knew better than to disturb his thoughts when he wore that expression. Chapter 4. The Translator's Tale. That afternoon, Poirot insisted we return to the museum. He wished, he said, to examine the scene of the theft once more with fresh eyes. Captain Cal had granted us access, though the gallery remained closed, to the public, while the investigation continued. Dr. Ard met us at the entrance, looking even more haggarded than he had the previous evening. The strain of the theft had clearly taken its toll. "The ministry is threatening to dismiss me," he said as he led us through the corridors. "They say I was negligent in my security arrangements, but how could I have anticipated such a thing?" "These matters are never simple," Poirot replied with sympathy. "Tell me, Dr. Hardag, this young woman who works as a translator, Mademoiselle Ferrick, is she here today, Nadia?" "Yes, she is in the archives." "Why do you ask?" "I would speak with her if I may." Ada's expression grew wary. "Surely you don't suspect Nadia?" "She is a good worker, very dedicated. I suspect no one and everyone, miss. It is the method of Hercule Poirot. We found Nadia Ferrick in a cramped office surrounded by dusty catalogues and filing boxes. She was a slender woman in her late 20 with dark hair pulled back in a practical style and intelligent brown eyes that held a trace of weariness, when she saw us in Terro, began settling into a chair opposite her desk. "I am Hercule, and this is Captain Hastings. We investigate the theft of the damsel of Constantinople. I've already spoken to the police," she said, her English accented but fluent. "I told them everything I know, which is nothing. Nevertheless, you will indulge me with a few questions." "Yes," Poe smiled disarmingly. "You were present at the gala that evening." "I was required to attend. Dr. Ardag needed translators available for the foreign dignitaries, and you were standing near the display case before the lights went out." She hesitated fractionally. "I was circulating among the guests. I may have passed by the case." "Yes." "The Countess Vasilv, you know her?" "I know of her. She has visited the museum several times, always asking about Byzantine pieces that she claims belong to her family. You do not believe her." "Claims?" Nadia's expression hardened. "I believe she is a woman clinging to a past that no longer exists. The Russian aristocracy lost everything when they fled. That does not give them the right to demand the return of treasures that have belonged to this land for centuries." "You feel strongly about this," Poirot observed. "I am Turkish, Miss Poirot. These are our artifacts, our history. Too much has already been taken by foreign museums and private collectors. A sentiment Dr. Ardag would share, I think. Of course, he has dedicated his life to preserving our cultural heritage." Poirot leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Tell me, Marcel, what do you know of a street vendor named Youssef?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "Youssef? The man who was killed. Nothing beyond what I read in the newspapers this morning. It's terrible, of course, but I don't see what it has to do with the theft. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything." Poirot watched her carefully. "You were not acquainted with him. Why would I be? I work in a museum. He sold trinkets to tourists. Quite so. And yet, is it not curious that he should be murdered on the very same night that a priceless Byzantine artifact is stolen? Constantinople is a dangerous city at night. Mu Poirot. Street vendors are vulnerable to thieves. That is the explanation most obvious." "Certainly." Poirot rose. "Thank you for your time, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful." As we left her office, I muttered, "She seemed rather nervous, don't you think?" She did indeed mourn me, but whether from guilt or merely from the natural anxiety of being questioned by the police, that remains to be determined. We spent the next hour at the scene of the theft. Poirot examined the shattered display case from every angle, measured the distance to the electrical box, and interviewed the museum guards who had been on duty that night. He was particularly interested in the construction of the case itself. "You see, Hastings," he said, crouching beside the broken glass, "the manner in which this was shattered tells us much. The force was not great. A sharp blow from inside, as I observed last night. But how? What sort of mechanism could produce such an effect? Perhaps an explosive device of some kind. Not there would be scorch marks, the smell of powder. This was done with precision, not violence." He straightened and turned to one of the guards. "When the case was installed, who supervised the work?" "Professor Godfrey, sir. He insisted on specific measurements for the cushion and the lighting." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "The British professor most interesting. After we left the museum, Poirot directed our driver to take us to a jeweler's shop in the old Armenian quarter. It was a tiny establishment, its windows filled with gold chains and precious stones that caught the afternoon light. The proprietor, a wise man with a jeweler's loop hanging from a chain around his neck, greeted us with courteous courtesy. "I seek information about a man named Isef," Poirot explained. "I am told he sometimes came here with gemstones to sell." The jeweler's expression grew guarded. "I knew Isef. A sad business. His death. He brought you stones recently, 2 days ago." "Yes, small pieces, nothing exceptional. Garnets, a few semi-precious stones. He said a tourist had sold them to him." "And you purchased them?" "I did. The price was fair for both of us." "Did he mention anything else? Any other transactions he was involved in?" The jeweler hesitated, then shrugged. "He said something about a big opportunity that he might have found a buyer who paid in gold, not paper. He was excited more than usual." "Did he say who this buyer was?" "No, and I did not ask. In this business, monsieur, one learns not to be too curious." As we emerged into the street, I said, "So, Isef knew about some valuable transaction just before the theft. Surely that can't be coincidence." "There are no coincidences in detective work, Hastings. There are only connections we have not yet perceived." Poirot paused, gazing toward the distant minarets of the old city. Someone approached Isef with a proposition, something involving the pendant. "I am certain of it. But was he a willing participant, or merely a convenient pawn? And what about Professor Godfrey supervising the installation of the display case? That seems suspicious." "Indeed, it does. As does Mademoiselle Ferrick's nervousness when we mentioned Yu's name and the Countess's passionate belief in her family's claim to the pendant." Poirot shook his head. "Too many threads. Mon ami, and they tangled together in ways that confuse rather than clarify." We walked through the narrow streets as the afternoon shadows lengthened. The city seemed to close in around us, its ancient stones holding secrets that stretched back through centuries of conquest and loss. Somewhere in this maze of history and deception, the truth waited to be uncovered. That evening, as I sat in our hotel room reviewing my notes, Poirot stood at the window looking out over the city. The lights of Constantinople were beginning to glow in the gathering dusk, and the call to prayer echoed from a dozen minarets. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we will visit the British Embassy. There are questions I must ask Sir Geoffrey. Questions about crates and shipping manifests, and the movement of archaeological artifact. You think the pendant has already left Constantinople? Think, Hastings, that nothing in this case is as it appears. Not the theft, not the murder, and most certainly not the pendant itself." His words hung in the air like a promise, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze drifting through the open window. Chapter 5. Poirot's denouement. The British Embassy occupied a stately building overlooking the Bosphorus, its Union Jack hanging limp in the still morning air. Sir Geoffrey received us in his private office, a room lined with leather-bound volumes and decorated with the sort of dignified restraint one expected of His Majesty's diplomatic service. "I've had word from London," he said, pouring us coffee from a silver pot. "They're most concerned about the international implications. If the pendant isn't recovered soon, there will be awkward questions in Parliament. Questions about what, precisely? Poirot asked, accepting his cup with a nod of thanks. Sir Geoffrey shifted uncomfortably about whether British interests were involved. Do you understand there have been rumours that certain parties in London were eager to acquire the piece for the British Museum? And were they? Not officially, of course, but there are always collectors, always those who believe that antiquities are better preserved in London than in their countries of origin. He sighed. It's a delicate situation. Tell me, Sir Geoffrey, about Professor Godfrey's presence in Constantinople. He was working on the pendant's restoration nest. Yes, he was hired by Dr. Ardegh several months ago. His expertise in Byzantine artifacts is considerably, despite that unfortunate business at the Ascolian. The forgery scandal, Poirot murmured. Most unfortunate indeed. And did Professor Godfrey arrange for any shipments of archaeological materials to leave Constantinople recently? Sir Geoffrey frowned. There was a crate sent to the British Museum those days ago, the morning after the gala. In fact, standard procedure for academic exchanges. Why do you ask? The contents of this crate, they were examined. Cursorily. Archaeological samples, pottery fragments, that sort of thing. Professor Godfrey provided all the necessary documentation. Poirot set down his cup with careful precision. Sir Geoffrey, I must ask you to do something for me. I require that crate to be intercepted and examined most thoroughly before it reaches the British Museum. Good Lord Poirot, you don't think. I think many things, Manami, but I prefer to deal in certainties. The crate, if you please. After leaving the embassy, we returned to the Jay's Museum. Poirot had requested that Captain Kimmel gather all the suspects in the main gallery at Trez that afternoon. The Turkish officer had been skeptical but agreed, curious to see what the Belgian detective had discovered. Before the meeting, however, Poirot insisted on one final interview. We found Professor Godfrey in the museum's restoration laboratory, a cluttered workshop filled with the tools of his trade. Brushes, chemicals, magnifying equipment. Professor, Poirot began without preamble. I have been examining the reports you prepared on the damsel of Constantinople, most thorough, most professional. Godfrey looked up from his work, his expression wary. Thank you. I take my responsibilities seriously despite what happened at Oxford. But of course, tell me, in your expert opinion, would it be possible to create a convincing replica of such a piece? The professor's hands stilled? Theoretically, yes. With the right materials and sufficient skill, a good forger could produce something that would fool most observers. But not you. Not if I examined it closely, no. And if you yourself were to create such a forgery, how long would it require? Godfrey's face flushed. What are you suggesting, Miss Poirot? I suggest nothing. I merely ask questions. How long, Professor? Several weeks, perhaps months. For a piece of that complexity, he stood abruptly. I don't care for your implications, sir. Then you will have the opportunity to correct them this afternoon. You will attend the gathering in the main gallery at Trez. Yes. The professor's jaw tightened, but he nodded. At the appointed hour they were all assembled, Dr. Ardegh standing stiffly near the shattered display case. Professor Godfrey with his arms crossed defensively, Countess Vassilv seated regally on a chair that had been brought for her, and Nadia Ferrick standing apart from the others, her face pale and drawn. Captain Kimmel and several of his officers stood by the doors. Poirot took his position before them, his hands clasped behind his back, his head tilted in that characteristic manner that signaled he was about to speak. Madame Secher, he began, we are gathered here because of a theft and a murder. Two crimes that appeared unconnected, yet which are bound together by threads of deception and disparity ambition. He began to pace slowly before them, his voice measured and precise. When I first examined this case, I was struck by certain contradictions. The theft was bold, theatrical, the dramatic blackout, the shattered glass, yet it was also efficient, suggesting careful planning. The murder of Isef appeared to be a simple robbery, yet a fragment of red velvet and a gold bead told a different story. Countess Vassilv leaned forward. "Do you know who stole the pendant, Miss Poirot?" "I know many things, madam. I know, for instance, that the glass case was broken from the inside by a small spring-loaded device cleverly concealed. I know that Isef was approached those days before the theft by Dosh, someone seeking his services as a middleman. I know that a crate of archaeological samples left Constantinople those days ago, the morning after the gala, in fact, carefully packed by Professor Godfrey." The professor's face went white. "I demand to know what you're accusing me of." "Patience, Missy. All will be revealed." Poirot turned to Dr. Ardag. "You were under great pressure, were you not? Pressure from the government, from foreign collectors, from those who questioned whether Turkey should possess such treasures." "Yes," Ardag admitted. "The ministry threatened to loan the pendant to Paris to London. I refused. It belongs here. So passionate you are about Turkey's heritage. Passionate enough, perhaps, to take desperate measures to protect it." The curator's eyes widened. "You cannot think that I think many things, Doctor. Aduc, as I think many things about Mademoiselle Ferrick, who was seen near the display case that evening, and who became most nervous when I mentioned Isef's name. Nadia took a step backward. I had nothing to do with his death. Perhaps not directly," Poirot said softly. "But you knew him, did you not? Despite your denial yesterday." Her composure cracked. "Ah, yes. He sometimes helped me acquire items for private collectors. Small things, nothing illegal. Until it was not small things, Nesper, until someone approached you with a proposition involving the damsel of Constantinople." Captain Keimer moved forward. "Mademoiselle Ferrick, you will answer Moirot's questions." But Poirot held up his hand. "Not yet, Captain. There is one more piece of this puzzle that must fall into place. One more thread that, when pulled, will unravel the entire tapestry of deception." He turned to face them all, his green eyes sharp and penetrating. "You see, the greatest deception in this case is not the theft itself. It is not even the murder, tragic though that was. The greatest deception lies in what you all believed you were stealing, killing for, protecting." A heavy silence fell over the crowd. Gallery. Outside, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, sending shafts of golden light through the high windows to illuminate the empty display case. A fitting symbol, I thought, for all that had been lost in this tragic affair. Poirot's expression was grave as he prepared to deliver the revelation that would expose the truth behind both crimes. Chapter 6. "The Mask of Authenticity, the Damsel of Constantinople," Poirot began, his voice carrying clearly through the gallery, "was discovered 6 months ago beneath the foundations of Hagia Sophia. A remarkable find, authenticated by experts, including Professor Godfrey here. It was declared genuine, priceless, a treasure of Byzantine history." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But there was a problem, was there not, Dr. Ardag? The Turkish government wished to loan the pendant to foreign museums. Paris requested it. London expressed interest. And you, Dr. Ardag, who had dedicated your life to preventing the plunder of Turkey's heritage, you could not bear the thought of this treasure leaving your country, even temporarily." The curator's face had gone ashen. I wanted only to protect it." "So you approached Professor Godfrey with a proposition. He was a man whose reputation had been damaged by scandal, a man who needed to prove himself once more. You asked him to create a forgery, a perfect replica that could be displayed while the original remained safely hidden." Professor Godfrey closed his eyes. "It was meant to be temporary, just until the pressure from the ministry subsided. A forgery good enough to fool everyone," Poirot continued. "And Professor Godfrey is indeed a master craftsman. The replica was flawless. It was this forgery that was placed in the display case for the gala unveiling." A collective gasp went through the room. Countess Vassilv rose from her chair, trembling with rage. "You mean to tell me that what was stolen was not even the real pendant?" "Precisely, madam. But you see, you had discovered this deception, had you not? Perhaps through your own contacts in the antiquities world, or perhaps you simply recognized that the gemstones, while beautiful, were not the same stones that had adorned the pendant when your family once possessed it. The setting was perfect, but a woman who had grown up hearing stories of her grandmother's jewels would notice such a substitution. You realized that the pendant on display was a fake, and you saw an opportunity. The Countess's aristocratic composure cracked. The pendant belonged to my family. If the museum was displaying a forgery, then the real one could be anywhere. By stealing the fake publicly, I would force them to admit the real pendant was elsewhere, and then I could pursue my family's rightful claim to it. A merry accusation of forgery they could deny, but the theft of a replica they could not hide. It would expose their deception and lead me to what was truly mine. So you arranged for the false pendant to be stolen, Poirot said. It was you, Countess, who visited Isef those days before the gala, wearing dark glasses and a silk scarf to conceal your identity. You contacted Mademoiselle Ferric, who had connections to the underworld through her work with Isef. Together you planned the theft, dramatic enough to draw attention, efficient enough to succeed. Nadia's voice was barely a whisper. She promised me money, enough to pay my debts and leave Constantinople. I was desperate. You arranged for the electrical box to be sabotaged, Poirot continued, addressing Nadia directly. You knew the museum's layout. You had access. The blackout was your signal. You moved quickly to the case and activated the small spring-loaded device you had planted inside the display earlier that day, a clever mechanism provided to you by the Countess. The glass shattered outward. You took the pendant, and in the confusion, you slipped away. Captain Camel stepped forward, and then what happened? Then came the part of the plan that went wrong, Poirot said gravely. Nadia needed to smuggle the pendant out of the museum undetected. Isef was meant merely to facilitate this, to hide the pendant in his cart among his wares and carry it through any police checks at the exits. A street vendor's cart would not be closely examined. But Isef, seeing the pendant after you placed it in his cart, realized its value. He did not know it was a forgery. He believed he held in his hands a priceless Byzantine treasure. I found myself leaning forward, caught up in Poirot's reconstruction of events. Nadia had hidden the pendant in Isef's cart to smuggle it through the bazaar, a clever precaution in case the police were searching for it at the museum exits. But when Isef discovered it among his wares, he recognized its value and refused to return it. He sent word to Nadia the next day through a street child. As such, messages are often conveyed in the bazaar that he had the pendant and would not give it back unless paid far more than the agreed sum. He thought he could sell it himself, make a fortune rather than the small payment he had been promised for his assistance. And so Nadia's voice broke. He would not listen to reason. He said he had a buyer who would pay in gold. I went to him that night, begged him to return it. We argued in the alley. He laughed at me, said I was a fool, and you killed him. Poirot finished gently, a single thrust to the heart. You searched his pockets, hoping to find the pendant, but it was not there. Perhaps he had already hidden it, perhaps sold it. You fled in panic, realizing too late that you had murdered an innocent man. Nadia collapsed into a chair, her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Captain Camel moved to arrest her, but Poirot held up his hand once more. There is still the matter of the pendant itself, the false one. Where is it now? From the doorway, a constable entered carrying a small package. He handed it to Captain Kamal, who carefully unwrapped it to reveal the glittering golden jeweled pendant. Found this morning, Kamal explained. In a pawn shop in the Biaz district. The proprietor said a street urchin brought it in yesterday. Claimed he found it in an alley behind the Grand Bazaar, where Isef had hidden it before he died, Poirot said. And so the circle is complete. A forgery created to protect a treasure, stolen by those who thought it genuine, fought over by a man who paid for his greed with his life. Dr. Ardag seemed to age before our eyes. The real pendant, it remains safe. I have hidden it where no one will find it until I am ready to reveal the truth to the proper authorities. You will reveal it now, Captain Camel said firmly. This deception ends today. As the constables led Nadia away, still weeping, and began to take statements from the others. I turned to Poirot. The Countess, will she be charged as well? That is for Captain Camel to decide. She orchestrated the theft, yes, but she believed she was exposing a fraud. Her motives, while misguided, were not entirely this honorable. He shook his head. As for Professor Godfrey and Dr. Ardag, they too acted from misguided principle. They wished to protect Turkey Key's heritage, but in doing so they created the circumstances that led to murder, and the real pendant will be recovered, and I suspect eventually displayed properly. But the stain of these events will linger. Poirot gazed at the shattered display case. You see, Hastings, this is what comes of deception. One lie begets another until innocent men die and desperate people destroy their own lives. Professor Godfrey approached us hesitantly. I want you to know, Miss Poirot, that I created the finest work of my career. The forgery was perfect. I do not doubt it, Professor, but perfection in the service of deception is still deception. As we prepared to leave the museum, I glanced back at the gallery. The afternoon light still streamed through the windows, illuminating the empty case where the damsel of Constantinople had briefly resided. It seemed a fitting monument to the vanity of human ambition, the dangerous nostalgia that had driven all the players in this tragic drama. Outside, the ancient city continued its eternal rhythm, indifferent to the small human tragedy that had played out within the museum's walls. Constantinople had seen empires rise and fall, had witnessed countless crimes and deceptions over its millennia of existence. One more would scarcely be remembered. Yet, as we walked through the narrow streets toward our hotel, I could not shake the image of Nadia Ferreric's anguished face, nor the thought of Youssef lying dead in a darkened alley, killed for a treasure that was not even real. The pursuit of glory, whether personal or national, had claimed 2 more victims in a city already haunted by too many ghosts. Epilogue. The Orient Express departs. The Orient Express stood waiting at Circuitus Station, its green and gold carriages gleaming in the morning sun. Steam hissed from the engine as porters loaded luggage, and passengers made their final farewells to Constantinople. Poirot and I stood on the platform, our bags already stowed in our compartment, watching the organized chaos of departure. 3 days had passed since the revelation in the museum gallery. 3 days in which the full scope of the deception had been laid bare, statements taken, and justice in its imperfect way begun to be served. Nadia Ferric had been charged with murder. Her trial would come in time, and though I pitied her disparate circumstances, there could be no excusing what she had done. Captain Camel had assured us that her cooperation in revealing the full details of the conspiracy would be considered by the court, but Youssef's death demanded accountability. Dr. Ardag had been dismissed from his position at the Top Cap Museum, though criminal charges had been avoided through diplomatic intervention. The real damsel of Constantinople had been recovered from its hiding place, a safety deposit box in a Swiss bank where Dr. Pradak had sent it months earlier through a trusted courier before the replica was even completed and would be returned to proper custody. The curator's career was finished, his reputation destroyed by the very deception he had crafted to protect Turkey Key's heritage. Professor Godfrey had left Constantinople the previous day, his return to England arranged quietly by Sir Geoffrey. The forgery scandal would follow him, but there were those who admired the technical brilliance of his work, even as they condemned the use to which it had been put. He would live out his days in the shadow of his own talent, forever known as the man who could create perfection, but had chosen to use it for deception. As for Countess Vasilv, she had been escorted from the city with a stern warning. Her role in orchestrating the theft had been acknowledged, but her age and her genuine belief that she was exposing fraud had earned her a measure of mercy. She would not be prosecuted, but neither would her claims to the pendant be entertained. The last I saw of her, she was boarding a train to Paris, her regal bearing intact, despite her defeat. A sad business, Poirot, I remarked as we watched the station activity. So many lives ruined over a piece of jewelry. Not merely jewelry, mon ami, a symbol. Poirot adjusted his hat with characteristic precision. The pendant represented different things to different people. To Dr. Ardag, It was Turkey's stolen past reclaimed. To the Countess, a connection to her lost world. To Nadia, it was freedom from debt and desperation. And to poor Isef, it was simply gold, the universal language of survival. And what was it really? Metal and stone. Hastings. Beautiful. Certainly, historical without doubt, but in the end, merely an object. It was the meanings that people imposed upon it that created the tragedy. A familiar figure approached us along the platform. Captain Kamal, in civilian clothes, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," he said, shaking our hands warmly. "I wanted to see you off, and to thank you properly. Without your assistance, this case might never have been solved. You are too kind, Captain. Your own men did excellent work, perhaps, but it was your insight that connected the theft to the murder that saw through the layers of deception." He held out the package. "I wanted to give you this as a token of appreciation." Poirot unwrapped it carefully to reveal a small Ottoman dagger in a leather sheath, its handle inlaid with mother-of-pearl. "It is beautiful," Poirot said, clearly moved. "But it is too generous, Captain." "Not at all. You have done Turkey a great service, though few will know of it. The pendant will be displayed properly now, with appropriate security, and without the taint of scandal. And Mademoiselle Ferrick, how does she fare?" Camel's expression grew somber. "As well as can be expected. She has confessed everything. In time, perhaps there may be mercy, but Isef's family deserves justice, and justice they shall have." After the captain departed, we boarded the train and settled into our compartment. The whistle blew, and with a lurch and a hiss of steam, the Orient Express began its journey westward, leaving Constantinople behind. As the city receded, its minarets and domes slowly shrinking into the distance, I found myself reflecting on the case and its bitter resolution. "You know, Poirot," I said, "I can't help but feel that everyone involved was in their own way a victim, even Nadia, who committed murder. That is because you have a generous heart, Hastings. But while we may understand the pressures that drove these people to their crimes, we cannot excuse them. Dr. Ardag chose deception. The Countess chose theft. Nadia chose murder. Each decision led inexorably to tragedy. But if Dr. Paradag had not created the forgery, then perhaps the real pendant would have been loaned to Paris or London, and he would have been forced to watch as Turkey's treasure traveled to foreign museums. Or perhaps it would have been stolen by more sophisticated thieves. Or perhaps nothing would have happened at all." Poirot shrugged with Jick fatalism. "We cannot know what might have been, mon ami. We can only deal with what is. Thank you for listening to the Damsel of Constantinople. Here on Whispers of the Night, Poirot reminds us that even the most dazzling treasures can hide the darkest deceits, and that truth, once uncovered, shines brighter than gold. If you enjoyed this mystery, please subscribe and share it with fellow lovers of intrigue. Until next time, stay curious, stay sharp, and may your evenings always be filled with good stories and warm company. This is Adam signing off from Whispers of the Night.